The year is 1137. In the heart of Tikrit, a city resting on the banks of the mighty Tigris River, a single night would decide the fate of the Muslim world. The moon hung low over the minarets, its pale light spilling into the courtyard of a modest home. Inside, a newborn cried for the very first time, his voice cutting through the stillness like an omen. Few could imagine that this fragile infant, born into a family on the brink of exile, would one day shake the foundations of Christendom itself. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The Crusaders called him Saladin, and before his story ended, his sword would reclaim the holiest city in Islam, Jerusalem. The world that greeted Saladin was not one of peace, but of chaos. The Crusaders had been in the Holy Land for almost 40 years, carving Christian kingdoms into the heart of the Muslim world. Jerusalem, the third holiest city in Islam, had fallen to their armies in 1099, its streets running red with the blood of the massacred. The great empires of Islam, the Abbasids in Baghdad, the Seljuks in Anatolia, and the Fatimids in Egypt, were fractured and feuding. Unity was a dream, and resistance was scattered. Saladin's father, Najmuddin Ayyub, was a respected officer and governor in Tikrit, serving under the Seljuks. His uncle, Asaduddin Shirkuh, was a battle-hardened general, a man whose very presence on the battlefield inspired fear. But in that fateful year, their fortunes changed overnight. One day, a wounded army from the Zengid dynasty arrived at the Tigris, fleeing defeat. Najmuddin showed mercy, helping them cross the river. This act of compassion enraged the local Seljuk governor, who saw it as treachery. Days later, a deadly quarrel erupted when Asaduddin killed a commander who had insulted him. The punishment was swift and absolute. The Ayyub family was ordered to leave Tikrit immediately. It was on the very night of their banishment that Saladin was born. The joy of new life was mingled with the pain of exile. Some whispered that the child's birth brought misfortune, that he was an ill omen, but Najmuddin believed otherwise. He saw in his son's dark, searching eyes the promise of destiny, a destiny far greater than Tikrit could hold. The family fled to Mosul, finding refuge under the protection of the powerful Zengid ruler, Imaduddin Zengi. Imaduddin recognized Najmuddin's talents and gave him the governorship of Baalbek, a fortress city that would later serve as Saladin's training ground. Under his uncle Asaduddin's guidance, the boy learned the arts of war, archery, swordsmanship, and horsemanship, but also the disciplines of the mind, religion, strategy, and the law. Yet in these early years, Saladin was no fierce warrior. He was quiet, reserved, and more interested in theology than bloodshed. Those who met him as a youth could not have guessed that he would become the scourge of the Crusaders. But fate has a way of preparing its champions in silence. Far to the south, the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt was crumbling under its own corruption, and the Crusaders, emboldened, prowled the borders like wolves. Saladin's path to greatness was forming, though he could not yet see it. What he did know was this: the Holy Land was in enemy hands, and the blood of the Prophet's followers had soaked its soil. Every prayer ended with the same plea, for Allah to send a liberator. No one imagined that the answer to those prayers was a boy born in exile, cradled in his mother's arms as his family rode into the cold night, leaving behind everything they knew. It was the beginning of a journey that would span decades, forge empires, and change the course of history, and it all started with the cry of a newborn, the cry of Saladin, the future liberator of Jerusalem. By the time Saladin reached manhood, the political map of the Middle East was a battlefield of shifting alliances. The Zengid dynasty, under the rule of the formidable Nuruddin Zengi, was leading the charge against the Crusaders. Saladin's father remained a trusted governor, and his uncle Asaduddin was among Nuruddin's most loyal generals. Saladin himself was still known more for his scholarship than his sword. He preferred the company of books to the clang of steel. He studied the Quran deeply, debated religious scholars, and admired the piety of the early Muslim leaders. In truth, he never sought the life of a warrior. His destiny, however, cared little for his preferences. The call to arms came unexpectedly. Egypt, ruled by the crumbling Fatimid Caliphate, had fallen into political chaos. Civil war and foreign intrigue had weakened it to the point where both Crusaders and Muslims saw it as ripe for the taking. When a rebellion broke out against the Fatimid vizier, Nuruddin dispatched Asaduddin Shirkuh to intervene, and ordered Saladin to accompany him. Saladin protested. He was no soldier, he insisted, and Egypt was a dangerous land, far from the safety of Damascus, but his uncle would not hear of it. "A man cannot choose the day his destiny arrives," Salahuddin told him. And so, the reluctant scholar set out with the army, unaware that this journey would place him on the throne of Egypt itself. When they arrived, Saladin was thrust into the heart of military life. Egypt was a cauldron of intrigue. Rival factions plotted against each other, Crusader forces lurked on the borders, and the Fatimid court was a nest of scheming officials. In this chaos, Saladin began to change. His quiet observation became a weapon. His patience turned into strategy. On the battlefield, he surprised everyone, perhaps even himself. He led men with calm authority, never losing his composure in the face of danger. Soldiers admired his fairness, his refusal to enrich himself at the expense of the common people, and his unwavering devotion to prayer, even in the midst of war. Egypt began to whisper his name with respect: Yusuf ibn Ayyub. In 1169, after years of struggle, Salahuddin died suddenly. The Fatimid Caliph, impressed by Saladin's character and competence, appointed the young commander as vizier of Egypt. It was an astonishing rise for a man who had once resisted even joining the campaign. Saladin accepted, but his eyes were fixed beyond Egypt's golden palaces and bustling markets. He understood that as long as the Muslim world remained divided, Sunni and Shia, Arab and Turk, rival dynasties vying for power, the Crusaders would hold Jerusalem. He began to reform Egypt from within. Corrupt officials were dismissed, taxes were reorganized, and the army was strengthened. Most significantly, Saladin ended the Fatimid Caliphate in 1171, restoring Egypt's allegiance to the Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. In one stroke, he united Egypt with the rest of the Sunni Muslim world, removing one of the Crusaders' greatest advantages, a divided enemy. But not everyone welcomed his rise. Nuruddin, still the master of Syria, grew uneasy at his young subordinate's growing independence. He summoned Saladin to return to Damascus. Saladin hesitated. Egypt was the key to the liberation of Jerusalem, and he would not abandon it. The tension between the two might have erupted into war, but fate intervened. In 1174, Nuruddin died suddenly, leaving his realm vulnerable. Rival claimants fought for control, and Crusader raids grew bolder. Among the chaos, a letter arrived for Saladin from Nuruddin's widow. She urged him to come to Damascus, not as a subordinate, but as a savior who could unite Syria and Egypt. Saladin seized the moment. Marching north, he entered Damascus without a fight, welcomed by the people as a leader who could finally bring unity. For the first time, the dream of a united Muslim front against the Crusaders seemed within reach. But unity was only the beginning. Ahead lay the most daunting challenge of all, confronting the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem and reclaiming the city that had been lost for nearly a century. Saladin had the power, the armies, and the vision. Now he would need the will to see it through, no matter the cost. With Syria and Egypt under his banner, Saladin stood at the head of the most powerful Muslim force in generations. But he knew unity was fragile. Old rivalries simmered beneath the surface, and some Muslim leaders preferred their own comfort to the risk of war. Saladin's vision was not just to rule, it was to free Jerusalem from Crusader hands, a goal that demanded more than armies. It required faith, discipline, and a cause so great that men would follow him into the jaws of death. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was no small foe. Since their bloody conquest in 1099, they had fortified their holdings and forged alliances with European powers. They controlled a chain of strongholds from the coast deep into the interior, and their knights were among the most feared warriors in the world. Yet, for all their strength, they had grown arrogant, and in their arrogance lay opportunity. One man, more than any other, provoked Saladin's wrath. Renaud de Chatillon. The Crusader Lord of Kerak, Renaud was notorious for his cruelty. He had attacked Muslim caravans, slaughtered pilgrims, and even threatened the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. His raids were not just acts of war, they were acts of desecration. Saladin swore an oath. If he ever captured Renaud, he would execute him with his own hand. But before vengeance could be taken, Saladin faced a bitter lesson in humility. In November 1177, he led an army into Crusader territory, aiming to strike a decisive blow. His scouts reported that the young Crusader king, Baldwin IV, stricken with leprosy and barely able to ride, was too weak to oppose him. Confident of victory, Saladin pushed forward. It was a trap. At Montgisar, near Ramla, Baldwin's forces ambushed Saladin's army, cutting through his lines with ferocious determination. The desert sands ran red with the blood of Saladin's men. His forces shattered, he barely escaped with his life, riding for days without rest. For most leaders, such a defeat would have been the end. But for Saladin, it was a beginning. Montgizar burned itself into his memory, not as a humiliation, but as a reminder. Victory would come not through overconfidence but through patience and preparation. He returned to Egypt and Syria with renewed determination. For the next decade, Saladin built his strength, forging alliances, fortifying cities, training his armies, and instilling in them a shared purpose. He was no longer merely a ruler, he was a commander with a sacred mission. His patience was rewarded in 1186 when Guy de Lusignan became king of Jerusalem. Guy was inexperienced and reckless, a ruler whose poor judgment would soon cost the Crusaders dearly. Reynaud, ever the instigator, broke a truce by attacking a Muslim caravan, a direct challenge to Saladin's authority. The time for patience was over. Saladin called his forces to arms. From Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and beyond, warriors gathered under his banner. On the eve of battle, he spoke to them not as a distant ruler, but as a fellow believer. Jerusalem is not just a city of stone. It is the heart of our faith, the land blessed by the footsteps of the prophets. The first to strike the enemy shall have my allegiance. The first to fall shall have my prayers. The stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in medieval history, the Battle of Hattin. It would not only determine the fate of the Crusader kingdom, but also bring Saladin face to face with his sworn enemy, Reynaud de Chatillon. The summer sun of 1187 blazed mercilessly over the hills of Galilee. On the morning of July 4th, the Crusader army, led by King Guy de Lusignan and Reynaud de Chatillon, marched toward Lake Tiberias. Thirst clawed at their throats, their armor scorched their skin, and the relentless heat weighed on their limbs like chains. Ahead of them, Saladin's forces waited, not in desperation, but in perfect formation. Saladin had chosen the battlefield with care. The Crusaders were trapped between his army and the parched hills, far from water. His cavalry harried them day and night, cutting off their supply lines. By the time the armies finally clashed near the horns of Hattin, the Crusaders were already broken in spirit. The battle began with the Muslim archers unleashing a storm of arrows, darkening the sky. Drums thundered across the valley as Saladin's infantry advanced, pressing the Crusaders back toward the hilltop. The true cross, the most sacred relic of Christendom, was carried into battle by the Crusader bishops, but it could not save them. Surrounded, dehydrated, and demoralized, the Crusader lines crumbled under Saladin's relentless assault. By nightfall, the once proud army of Jerusalem was destroyed. King Guy was taken prisoner. Reynaud de Chatillon, bound and defiant, was dragged before Saladin's tent. The Sultan offered the king cool water, a gesture of mercy, but when the same was extended to Reynaud, Saladin intervened. To give water was to grant protection, and Saladin had sworn none to this man. "You promised peace," Saladin said coldly, "yet you violated it. You attacked pilgrims under the protection of Allah." Reynaud spat his defiance, refusing to beg for his life. Without another word, Saladin struck him down with his own hand, fulfilling the oath he had made years before. The road to Jerusalem now lay open. City after city surrendered as Saladin's army advanced, his reputation for honor and justice preceding him. By late September, his banners stood before the walls of Jerusalem itself. Inside, the Crusaders braced for a siege, fearing a slaughter to rival their own bloody conquest in 1099. But Saladin was not the kind of conqueror they knew. After 12 days of siege, the defenders, led by Balian of Ibelin, negotiated terms of surrender. Saladin agreed to spare the city's inhabitants if they paid a ransom. For those who could not, he opened his treasury and paid their freedom himself. On October 2, 1187, the 27th of Rajab in the Islamic calendar, the anniversary of the Prophet's night journey, Saladin entered Jerusalem. The air was heavy with the call to prayer as the muezzin's voice echoed through the streets for the first time in nearly a century. Christian women who had cut their hair to avoid assault were shown respect and protection. Churches were left standing. The Holy Sepulchre remained untouched. In the courtyard of Al-Aqsa Mosque, a moment long promised was fulfilled. The magnificent wooden pulpit, commissioned by Saladin's mentor Nuruddin years before, was finally installed. A symbol of the unity and determination that had brought Jerusalem back under Muslim rule, the fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through Europe. Bells tolled in sorrow. Kings vowed vengeance. The Third Crusade was coming. led by some of the most formidable rulers of the age, among them Richard the Lionheart. But Saladin was ready. He had faced the fire once before at Montgizar. This time he would meet it on his own terms. It was the autumn of 1192. The air over the Holy Land was thick, not with the clang of swords, but with something far heavier, the weight of two titans locked in a battle of wills. On one side stood Salahuddin Ayyubi, Saladin, the Sultan whose name had become a war cry for his people and a whisper of dread among his enemies. On the other stood Richard Plantagenet, Richard the Lionheart, a king whose courage was matched only by his stubborn pride. The Crusades had raged for years. Cities had burned, armies had bled into the desert sands, and the holy city of Jerusalem, the prize of kings and the heart of faith, stood at the center of it all. Richard had tried and failed to take it. Saladin had defended it, but could not drive the Crusaders into the sea. Both men were warriors, but now they were tired warriors. They understood something few leaders did, that sometimes the greatest victories are won not by steel, but by words. The two never crossed swords, not once. Instead, they crossed something far sharper, their minds. They spoke through envoys, trading offers, threats, and gestures of respect. Saladin sent Richard fruit and snow from the mountains to cool his fever. Richard sent Saladin a fine Arabian horse in return. Each understood the other's nature, Richard's ambition and pride, Saladin's honor and pragmatism. And so, like two master chess players, they circled each other, move after move, neither willing to be the first to topple. Finally, in September 1192, the game reached its end. The Treaty of Ramla was signed. It was a deal born not of surrender, but of mutual recognition. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims, unarmed, would be allowed to enter freely and worship in peace. The coastal cities from Jaffa to Tyre would remain in Crusader hands. It was not the victory Richard had promised his followers, nor the complete triumph Saladin's warriors had dreamed of, but it was peace, fragile, imperfect, yet real. And in that moment, the world saw something rare. Two great warriors, both unwilling to destroy what little remained of the land for the sake of pride. Less than a year later, in March 1193, Saladin was gone, not cut down in battle, not poisoned by an assassin's hand, but taken by fever at the age of 55. When his servants prepared his body, they found no gold, no jewels, no treasure. The man who had ruled an empire died with barely enough to pay for his own funeral. He had given it all away, to the poor, to the widows, to the orphans of war, and yet what he left behind was far greater than gold. He left behind a legacy of honor in an age of cruelty. He left behind a story that even his enemies told with respect. And he left behind a reminder that power, when wielded with mercy, can outlive any empire. Saladin's duel with Richard the Lionheart was not just a chapter in history. It was proof that even in the bloodiest of wars there can be space for honor, and that sometimes the most enduring victories are not carved into stone, but into the memory of mankind.